Hi, this is Dr. Jacobs, and this week we're going to learn about Chapter 6, Observational Methods. By the end of this unit, there's some things that I want you to be able to do. I want you to be able to compare and contrast different qualitative methods of studying behavior that we'll talk about this week. I want you to be able to describe naturalistic observation and discuss methodological issues such as participant and concealment and the limitations of this approach. I also want you to be able to describe systematic observation and discuss methodological issues such as the use of equipment, reactivity, reliability, and sampling. I want you to be able to summarize the features of a case study. I also want you to be able to define archival research, and I want you to be able to describe the different sources of archival data, such as statistical records, survey archives, and written records, and how they can be used to answer research questions. All right, so observational methods, the ones that we're going to go over this week are more qualitative in nature. When we're working in this class, we're primarily concerned with quantitative data, but there is a whole field of research that deals with more of these observational methods that also get used in the real world as well. So we're going to discuss naturalistic observation, systematic observation, case studies, and archival research. All right, so quantitative versus qualitative research. If you had stats with me, you'll know that I define both of these very differently. Within research world, people sometimes really fight over what's better, quantitative or qualitative research. And so let's talk about what they mean. Quantitative data is information represented by numbers. So research in this is kind of like what you learn to do in your prereq stats class. So when we're doing inferential statistics, like an independent samples t-test or a repeated measures ANOVA or a Pearson product moment correlation or linear regression, all of that is where we're going to have some sort of measure. If you remember from earlier in the content for this class, a measure is something that basically turns information into numbers so that we can analyze it using statistical analyses. So quantitative data is kind of what we'll focus on in this class, but there's also qualitative data, and this is the information that's represented by words. Like I told you all, there's a big rift sometimes between whether people prefer quantitative or qualitative data. If you're in this class, that probably means that your field that you're going into does prefer to use quantitative data, and that's okay. There is value in both. So there's a difference between asking someone, what age were you when you had your first kiss, right? Which would give us a quantitative number. Someone might say like 12 or 14 or 52. I have no idea. And then qualitative data would be more like, what did your first kiss feel like? And someone might say it was gross or it was magical, whatever their opinion was of their first kiss. And so these pieces of data do completely different things. And so sometimes students mistakenly think that qualitative data or qualitative research is actually easier to do than quantitative. If you had a solid stats teacher and you learned kind of the rhythm and the template for doing quantitative research or inferential statistics, it's actually just follows the same template. It has the same format, the same steps over and over again. So once you learn and unlock what that template or those steps are, it's actually not hard. A lot of the work will actually be done by a computer. Whereas qualitative data, there's so much work that goes into that. And we'll talk about that within this unit a little bit. There are also people who see value in both. I see value in both types of research, and they call this mixed method research, where you use both quantitative and qualitative data. For this class, we'll be doing exclusively quantitative projects. We're building on these each week, but we will do quantitative in here. So qualitative approaches, the book describes some of them, some of it in not very much detail. So narrative research, phenomenological research, grounded theory research, ethnographic research, case study research. Okay, so let's talk about naturalistic observation. So whenever we do naturalistic observation, the researcher makes observations of individuals in their natural environments. Sometimes they call natural environments the field. This stems back to the difference between research that's done within a laboratory setting where things can be really tightly controlled versus things that are a little bit more messy when they're out in real life. Sometimes researchers find that there's significant differences and things that are tested in a lab where everything's controlled. And then when you deal with all the outside variables of real life, it really actually kind of changes what goes on. There are some other names for naturalistic observation, such as field work, field observation, or ethnography. And the goal of this type of research is to provide a complete and accurate picture of what occurred in the setting rather than to test a hypothesis formed prior to the study. So if we were doing qualitative research, you would not be going through the hypothesis testing steps necessarily as you learned in your stats class. But it also depends on what kind of research you're doing. So sometimes qualitative researchers will have something called a central question that they develop before doing qualitative research, but naturalistic observation is a very specific type of qualitative research. During this type of research, you need to keep and interpret field notes. The book mentioned that sometimes people write those down, sometimes people dictate them. There's several different ways that people can take those notes. And there are some goals of this type of research. One is to describe a setting, events, and persons that were observed. But another goal is to analyze what was observed. So it's not just enough to watch what's going on, but to try to analyze what was going on. And so there are some problems with naturalistic observations. So let's talk about participation and concealment. So in naturalistic observation, there's two different type of observers or different types of observation. The person doing the observing could be considered a non-participant observer or observation. And this is when an outsider does not become like an active part of the setting. So for example, to be a professor, when we're teaching in person, before we get tenure, before we go up to be full professor, we have to have a peer come in and observe our teaching at a minimum once a year or once a semester. We also have to have our chair of our department or school come in and observe us as well. And so if they come in and observe, but they don't become an active part of the setting, then they would be non-participant observers. In those situations, they're trying to help faculty become better teachers. They're trying to observe ways that they can help the faculty member increase class engagement or help them with problems that they're having in class to be supportive. Now, participant observation is a little bit different. This is when the participant observer becomes actively involved with the people who they are observing. And these things give you different things, right? So once you become a friend with someone, that changes the relationship. So some people would say that a con of that might be that they lose the objectivity necessary to conduct scientific observation. People who do quantitative research would say that this isn't really doing research at all, that it's very biased and things like that. Qualitative researchers, then to defend themselves, would tell quantitative researchers potentially that, well, yeah, it's okay to have numbers, but there's no meaning behind the numbers. You can't find the context and nuance in those numbers. And so that's why those are kind of some pros and cons for the different types. We also have systematic observation, and this is careful observation of one or more specific behaviors in a particular setting. The researcher is interested in only a few very specific behaviors. The observations are quantifiable, and often the researcher has developed prior hypotheses about the behaviors. So defining the behavior in observable and measurable terms, they do this so that they can develop some sort of coding system. And when they do this, sometimes you'll hear it referred to as coding book. Systematic observation is not the only time within qualitative research where there will be some sort of coding system developed. And so all a coding system is a set of rules used to categorize the observations that you're making. So methodology, sometimes there's a little bit of different types of methodological issues within the systematic observation. First, determining kind of what kind of equipment that you want to use. So if you use paper and pencil, you could actually observe and code at the same time. And several school psychologists will do this while they're observing children to determine if whatever they're looking at. So you could be looking at a kid with ADHD for on-task, off-task behaviors. You could be examining classroom environment to see how well a teacher has I don't want to say control of her class, but good class management skills. Uh, you could also go into using tech too. So sometimes people will use just video and audio recordings, and then you don't even have to have an observer present within the thing or within the environment. And so you can go through and code using that because there are problems with systematic observation. For example, reactivity. Just putting someone else in the room could potentially influence how people act. So if we go back to the example of like if I have someone observing my teaching, just having another person in the room could change how my students react. If my students like me, maybe they'd be really great and participate really well in class because they're like, ooh, we want to show off how awesome and how smart we are and how good of a class this is. Or conversely, if they really don't like the teacher, they may misbehave more to try to like get them quote unquote in trouble when that's not the purpose of the observation to begin with. And so earlier we talked about reliability. If we remember, that's kind of the consistency of a measure. I didn't really care for how the materials defined this. They actually kind of blurred the line between what reliability and validity were. But when we're talking about reliability, we're talking that the measure or the tool that we're using to turn information into numbers, or if you're trying to code themes like we would do for qualitative research, that it's consistent. So for example, when I first started here at UCM, we did a study on family dynamics within families after a cold case homicide. So in this, we were looking for themes and we had key questions that we had, and we had these interviews that had been transcribed, and we'd go through and see what themes were present. And so in order to have uh like a theme go into our code book, we'd have to have at least two of the three observers agree on the different themes. Ideally, all three would agree. If you have more, usually we call that inter-rater reliability. We want to have about 80% or higher in agreement by the raters. But when you're doing that type of code book, sometimes you only have three people, so you settle for the kind of 2 out of 3. I also have sampling behaviors and experiences. So experience sampling method, ESM, is used to alert participants to complete a data collection procedure at that very moment in time. This has another name, and actually in the field of suicidology, we call this ecological momentary assessment, or EMA. And so studies they do for suicide are really going toward EMAs because we found that people's self-reports were not super reliable after even a 2-week period. And so instead of having them do it on a cell phone, there would be like some sort of smart watch that participants would wear, and it would ask multiple times during the day for participants to rate their level of suicidal thoughts and behaviors. And then so they would use that because we see that suicidal thoughts can be really, really variable. And when people have suicidal thoughts, they don't always necessarily remember the ones that they were having, even 2 weeks later. There's also something called day reconstruction method, or DRM. This asks participants to think about the previous day and write about distinct episodes that occurred. Our memories as humans are not great. So one drawback to this type of method is that we're not really great at remembering details as humans. Our brains are very, very, very limited. There are also things called case studies. And this is an observational method that provides a detailed description of an individual or a group of people who constitute a family, a work group, a school, a neighborhood, a situation, things like that. You'll see a lot of case studies in like historical psych type things. So like Freud would have case studies that he would share. You see a lot of this when you're going through psychological training, especially as you work through becoming a clinician in diagnosis and therapy. So case studies can be naturalistic observations if you remember out in the field, but not necessarily are they always naturalistic observations. So for example, you could have where you have that naturalistic observation and you write a case study of the things that you learn, but you can also have some sort of like record review where you're reviewing records. Say like I'm a student that's doing a predoctoral internship in psychology, and we're in a case study for group supervision. And before I actually see a client, if I'm doing a big assessment, I might go through all of their medical records that have been sent in and develop a case study talking about symptoms, previous, like if they had criminal infractions, other diagnoses they've had before, medical history, like were they born premature? Have they been hospitalized? What for? What kind of problems are they presenting with? Things like that. And you might bring them into a group supervision to discuss strategy. Um, but that may not necessarily come from you observing it. It could come from a record review as well. There's a very special type of case study called a psychobiography. And this is a type of case study where a researcher applies like psychological theory to explain the life of someone. A lot of times these can be like historical figures or famous people. There's also archival research. This is where you use previously compiled information to answer research questions. There's different types of these. We have statistical records. So, for example, a long time ago when I taught, we used to have a master's program here. I taught an advanced method, an analysis class. So it was like research methods and stats combined, but for master's students. And when I did that, I had a student who got all of the police records from Chicago PD and examined different things that dealt with arrest records. You could look at temperature history, different standardized tests have records of things like ACT scores and stuff like that. So you could use that as archival research. And there's also survey archives that have data from surveys that are stored digitally. There's a really big movement within science to try to have open access. So that means give access to data and things so that people can do studies and try to make the world a better place by doing that. The book gave, I think, like 2 or 3 examples, and I actually have the links when you download this Google Slides to keep for your records. You'll see that I had some links there if you're interested in looking at some sources of it. And then there's also written audio and video records. So these could be historical diaries from famous people, letters, Facebook posts. And it's kind of funny because if you like look at a lot of historical museums or presidential museums, like the Truman Library in Independence used to have like letters and diary things that are diary entries as part of the exhibit. So if you went and used those entries and started doing research on those, that would be archival research as well. So archival research, we'll talk about content analysis. This is the systematic analysis of existing documents. This also requires a coding system. We won't go over in this class how to do those coding systems because we're more focused on quantitative research in this class. If you're wanting to do qualitative research, you would need to find kind of a research mentor that already does that, that can walk you through the process or take a class on it itself. So that is where we're going to end the lecture for this week. I hope all is going well, and I'll talk to you soon.